we're going to move on to our next segment here. And I'll see if I can make this one shorter. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into the weeds on some of the things we just discussed previously. And we have another Gita excerpt here, and we're going to talk about how religions exchange with one another. And then we're going to talk a little bit about dates and controversies and pi. Actually, it's Proto-Indo-European, Aryan invasion, glottochronology. So these are our topics for this session, session 5. So here is our Gita excerpt from for session 5, and this is from the first verse of the 4th chapter. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Imam Vivashate Yogam Proktavan Aham Avyayam Vivasvan Manave Praha Manar Ikshvakave Bravit. The personality of Godhead, Lord Shri Krishna, said, I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god Vivasvan, and Vivasvan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed it to Ikshvaku. So this verse is what we were talking about before. How did Bhagavad Gita get into the world? Well, Krishna instructed it. Not only does it come from his flute, not only was it at the very beginning of the universe, but also Krishna personally instructed it to the sun god, Vivasvan. And Vivasvan instructed it to his son, Manu. And Manu is very important as a controlling factor, or as a overarching king for humankind in general. And he lives for enormous lengths of time. And he instructed it to his son Ikshvaku. So, any questions about this little bit from Bhagavad Gita, or Bhagavad Gita excerpt? Yeah. Can you, Phil, because our Noah just jumped out of the room here, if you can hold the mic to him, the mic which is right next to you.
Did I press anything?
What's that?
Did I press the right button?
No, you don't have to do it. It's on, it's going to stay on.
Did the battle that was chronicled in the Gita, did that happen on planet Earth?
Yeah, it happened on planet Earth.
And around what time?
Around also 5,000 years ago. Most of this all occurs, the Battle of Kurukshetra, the writing of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna coming to the planet, all these things were right around, 3000 BC.
Okay.
Kali Yuga starts around 3004 BC or something like that. I forgot what the exact.
That happened in India?
Yeah.
Okay.
It happened in India.
All right, thank you.
So that's kind of the overall perspective of where this is coming from and when this all happened. Okay.
It's a short question. If you mentioned that Gita was given the sun god first of all, right? So, and now we have just the second edition, not second edition. I mean, the second time it's given to us.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
What happened, and Krishna explains it in 4th chapter, is that the succession was broken. He explains it to Arjuna that, my dear Arjuna, I first gave this to the sun god, but now the succession is broken and the knowledge as it is appears to be lost. And so Krishna is again speaking Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, starting a new chain of things. So sometimes Vedic knowledge gets submerged, it gets lost, it gets altered or diffused, watered down, whatever you want to say. And then again it surfaces when Krishna doesn't want to see this knowledge completely lost. So someone has it somewhere. Sometimes in the state of the universal affairs, lots of people have Vedic knowledge. Other times, not so many. And so that's the way it works. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we'll move to the next thing. So we see that religions are not etched in stone, that religions interact with one another. And in this way, we'll give some, history of how that works, In around 600 BCE, there was a religion that rose to prominence in the Middle East called Zoroastrianism. And this religion was way before Islam. And this religion talked about a anti-God. And this is the first instance in the world religions where there was an anti-God. In this case, Angra Mainyu. So in Zoroastrianism, we have this idea of a positive God figure, Ahura Mazda, and he's fighting a negative figure called Angra Mainyu. And this concept gets borrowed into first Judaism, and then later Christianity, and then later Islam. But there is no such thing in the Vedic tradition of a negative, almost as powerful as God being that God has to trouble and fight against. There is Maya, but Maya is a servant of God, and she does a thankless task of bewildering the living entities. So she's doing that. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a quick question because I wondered about this too. So it's Kali is controlling, right, during the Kali Yuga over Earth. Right. And I've also heard that according to like Christian faith or something like that the devil's the god of this earth at this moment or something like that. He said that devil's the god of this earth currently.
Yeah. Something like that, right?
So do you think maybe that could be correlated where maybe it's not necessarily an anti-god, but rather an evil or a negative force that's ruling over the time period where, the reality is it's like a controlled, what do you call it? A controlled demolition, like how they do with buildings?
Yeah. Well, it's not really like that. There's always a positive influence that brings us towards spiritual life. And there's always the possibility of a negative influence that brings us away from spiritual life. The material world always has both of those dynamics going on. And it's according to our desires and our actions which way we go. Do we go with the flow that goes towards spiritual life, or do we go with the flow that goes away from spiritual life? And there are beings that help us either way we want to go. And so the material world, we have 4 yugas, and Sat Yuga is the best of the yugas. That means that things are very nice in Sat Yuga. There are not many people who are really seriously demoniac in Satya Yuga. And then you have Treta Yuga where things are a little bit not so nice, You have beginning of where we have to have organization and government, and we have to have punishments, and people have to grow food and all this kind of stuff. So that's Treta Yuga, not quite so nice. And there are some people who are really not really that plugged into spiritual life. And then you have Dwapara Yuga, where it's getting kind of into the 50-50 range. And then you have where we are, in Kali Yuga, where most of the people are irreligious.
Leftovers, right?
What's that?
Leftovers, right?
Leftovers.
We live in the Kali Yuga, we're leftovers.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what it works is according to karma, we are born in a certain location at a certain time. So people of our karma would not be eligible to be born in Satya Yuga. So we get born now. So in other words, there's always going to be a proportion of people in the material world who aren't interested in God, and a proportion who are. The proportion is in Kali Yuga, the time that we are now, is way greater of those who don't want to be, because somewhere all those people have to have their big party. So as I put it, the Kali Yuga is the big block party for all those people who really couldn't care less about God, And, so we can't just have a material world that allows good people to do good things, because if that was the way it was, there'd be no reason having a material world at all, People could just stay in the spiritual world, But the material world is designed as a place for people who aren't so keen on serving God. When they come here, some are seriously not keen on serving God. So Kali Yuga is for them. And
so like when you sieve the flowers, so we live in Kali Yuga, so that's what was not sifted, so now we have to work.
Flowers?
No. You sifted flowers, so in Kali Yuga we are just like some particle. Huh?
You mean flour with cooking?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. So we are just like particles. We should be just cleansed and go just through this, right?
Yeah, right. So in Kali Yuga, we are, we are placed here because we were the kind of worst of the worst. Not just, all of us. That's why we're in Kali Yuga. But some of us discovered somewhere along the line, we got some mercy, that maybe going down to the pit isn't the best thing we could be doing with ourselves. And we decided to turn our ship around. So that's why we're making some reclamation. But many other people have not come to that realization yet. And as a result, they are, lost in the material world. Now, Christianity turns this into the devil versus God, We say that God has no problem in overcoming anything, so we're not worried about, God not being able to overcome evil influence. But He's designed this world the way it is, and people who want to dislocate or disconnect from God, they're never going to have an easy time of it, because material nature is designed to give them the result of their negative activities, their negative karma. But they're free to ignore God. Nobody's forced to pay attention or serve or worship God or care about God. There are consequences if you don't, but no one's forced to. So at any rate, that's kind of a quick look at that. Then we have, around 600 BC, as we were talking about, Buddhism breaks off from the Vedas. The Vedas were there, and Buddhism picks up many of the concepts of the Vedas, but it is considered a Naistiki religion. Astika means asti is it is so. So that means that Asti religions, they accept the Vedas, but Buddhism is considered a Nasti or Nastiki religion, a religion that has given up the Vedas. However, in Buddhism we see many of the same principles that the Vedas have about understanding how suffering works, about the idea of reincarnation to a certain extent, and many other principles about how wrong desire causes suffering. So a lot of things that are common, kind of the way that Christianity breaks off from the Old Testament or from the Jewish tradition, in a very similar way. So they have a common root, but Christianity goes one way and Judaism doesn't cease to exist, it goes its way. And similarly, the Vedas and what we call Vaishnavism goes one way, but Buddhism went a different way. And so around 600 BCE that happens. And then, as we said before, about 260 with Emperor Ashoka, India turns Buddhist, and then, around 100 CE, that's when Christianity is enough of a different thing from the Judaic tradition it came out of, that it's no longer a branch of Judaism, it's its own thing, So, we could quibble about that data. It's hard to put a real date on some of these things. Then we have, at 730 Common Era, Buddhism is driven out of India by Adi Shankara. So, around 260 BCE, India turns Buddhist, and 730 CE, Buddhism gets kicked out of India. By who? By Shankaracharya. So Shankaracharya does preaching all over India, and Buddhism leaves India, but it is assimilated in the Orient, in particularly China and Korea and Japan and those countries. They become Buddhist countries, whereas India still has some Buddhists living there, but it's not a very big percentage. So then we have, in 870, Islam saves Greek culture. So in Europe, the Roman Empire had collapsed and things were going into the Dark Ages. And these Greek writings, these pre-Socratics and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, all these ideas get lost and the books get burned and destroyed. But Islam saves those books. And that's how there's later a renaissance of Greek thinking. But it wouldn't have happened if Islamic people hadn't gotten interested in Greek writing. So we said that Christianity, as we see here in 1260, Christianity accepts the Greek philosophy because there were things missing in the Christian philosophy. We talked about that last week. So where were they going to get them? They get them from the Greeks. And so around 1260, Aristotle was accepted by St. Thomas Aquinas, who he had to do some, fine-tuning here and there because Aristotle is pretty materialistic, but Christianity accepted Aristotle. Previous to that, similarly in Islam, they were looking at the Greek philosophers too, so they borrowed some Greek philosophers. This shows that religions do interact with one another, and in some cases one overrules another, in some cases one borrows some ideas from one another, and this is the main idea I wanted to put here, so we can get that kind of under our belt. And so we talked already before about the big Vedic timeline. And we talked about these axioms like materialism and naturalism, which are accepted in our modern thinking. And this is why people have trouble with understanding Bhagavad Gita, because we see it and we read things like, that there were 600 million soldiers on the Battle of Kurukshetra, and we think, how is that possible, And we hear things like that, many stories in the Mahabharata, by our current way of looking at things, will seem supernatural. And so therefore, modern people will tend to reject them. But there is nothing that proves that the supernatural doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, most people in the world have had some intersection in their lives with something supernatural, and that's why the people who play the role of saying that there's only natural causes, that there's only matter, those people really have to do a lot of work because they have to reject everything. They have to reject that there's ESP, that there could be a soul. They have to reject that there are any kind of unusual creatures, cryptids. They have to reject that there are UFOs. They have to reject that there's reincarnation. They have to reject that people can communicate over long distances. They have to reject ghosts. All these kinds of things. Many people have had some personal interaction with at one point or another, but this really hard-nosed, scientific, materialistic, reductionistic idea has to chuck all that stuff out the window. But most people have seen that there is some validity to some of these things. Certainly, there are people who take advantage of this. Certainly, there's a lot of people who are, making a buck by, writing on people's superstitions and things like that. But there is an element of reality to all these paranormal things. So we have mythology. People think of the Vedas, or for that matter, any ancient scripture, as being mythology. People couldn't have lived 600 years, like it says in the Bible, but in the Vedas we find that people lived 100,000 years in Satya Yuga. So in that way, the Bible and the Vedas are similar in their time scale. That as the yugas go on, people live shorter durations of lives, to where in Kali Yuga people only live 100 years. In Dwapara Yuga people used to live 1,000 years. In Treta Yuga people used to live 10,000 years, and in Satya Yuga people used to live 100,000 years average lifetime. So our lifetimes have changed. So empiricism means that we can only accept what we actually can find and we can think about in our own, laboratories, in our own archaeology, in our own investigations. But it's impossible to put together a full philosophy based on an empiric approach. Philosophy itself, at one time, had the purpose of bringing people to a better way of life. Now philosophy is mostly kind of mental chess, where people see who can talk the best story, And of course we find that early Indologists, when the Western world discovered India and wanted to find out things, they sent people there to investigate. The British did that, the Germans did that, the French did that. There were a lot of people who went to India to study, to find out what was there, And from England, at least, when England began to have more of a hold in a political way over India, then the first Indologists that went in were actually Christians, and mostly they had the idea of wanting to convert the entire Indian population to Christianity. And so their idea of understanding the Vedas was so they could debunk them. And the reason we bring this up is we'll begin to see how scrambled the approach to Western concepts of Indian philosophy are. Because the first people who tried to understand Indian philosophy were doing it with the one purpose of debunking it. That was their motivation for doing it. Now, the later Indologists, they didn't believe Christianity either. So they were debunking it because it was unscientific. So you've got two levels of people going in studying Indian philosophy. One group, the first group, was to debunk it from a Christian point of view. The second was to debunk it from a scientific point of view. And so we've talked now about the fact that India was gradually, became Buddhist, and then it was changed back by Sankaracharya to a Vedic view, but it was a Mayavadi Vedic view. Then we have that Indologists came in there and they tried to convert the Indians to Christianity, then you had scientific debunking. So is it any wonder that even in India, most people don't have any concept of what their original philosophy was? This is what, as I call, scrambled, refried culture, so it was pretty mixed up. And so, again, we're back to Prabhupada as it is. He's explaining things as it is. It's not scrambled, it's not refried. He's explaining it according to not his view, but the view of the past teachers and the view of the past writers about the Vaishnava tradition. You had a question. You were raising your hand.
I'm trying to think what it was.
Oh.
I had some questions throughout the thing. You answered one of them, which was the Sankaracharya. You confirmed that. I was wondering about that. And then, yeah, I don't remember what it was for this portion.
Okay. So, any questions about this? I'm trying to move faster here. Okay. So finally, we'll just wrap this up with PI, invasion and linguistics. So PI stands for Proto-Indo-European. When Indologists first went in to India, especially from European countries, they discovered, to their surprise, that the Sanskrit language was very obviously close to Latin. So Sanskrit and Latin have similar structure, and many of the words are very similar. And so what to make of this? Could this group of Indians actually have been previous to the Latin cultures of Europe? This didn't sit well, naturally speaking. We still had this idea that Christianity has to be better. And among others, we had this idea that science has to be better. These crude Indian people couldn't have anything really to offer us, So as a result, they invented Proto-Indo-European, PI. This is a language that nobody has ever been known to speak. We don't know who spoke it, when or where. We don't have any examples of it. We don't have any race that supposedly spoke it. It's a manufactured concept. So instead of saying that Latin came from Sanskrit, instead what they have said is that Latin and Sanskrit came from a third language, Proto-Indo-European. And so there it is. And it's still, if you look at books on linguistics, it will never claim that anything comes from Sanskrit other than modern Indian languages. They'll say Hindi comes from Sanskrit, Bengali comes from Sanskrit, Gujarati, et cetera, These languages come from Sanskrit, but never that Latin comes from Sanskrit. Rather, both of them come from Proto-Indo-European. Then we have the Aryan invasion theory. So, could the Indians actually have had this ancient culture? Western scholarship says no. Instead, where did Indians get this Vedic knowledge? They got it from some mystery European group that invaded India and taught India the Vedas. And that group that idea was put forward by Max Muller, And, of course, there's never been any archaeological evidence that there was some great invasion and these conquering people, because obviously there would be battlegrounds, there would be bones, there would be, great thing. And we don't see that in the Hindu Kush. It doesn't exist. So now, this theory, of course, the question was, well, who was it? Where did these guys come from? So one by one, we had various cultures coming forward. Hitler was sure it was the Germans that did it. That's where Hitler got into the whole Aryan concept. He thought it must have been the Germans that came and taught this Vedic stuff to the Indians, and that's where it all came from. Scandinavians, we had, the Russian steppes, is now where they think somewhere, at least a certain part of Russia is where these people supposedly came from. But Vedas don't have any such information in them at all, that this Vedic information had come from some other outside group. However, now I've noticed in books, they don't talk about the Aryan invasion theory anymore. They call it the Aryan migration. So it's a little bit played down now, but that's kind of where it is. So, at any rate, we can see how racism and chauvinism plays in. If you say this in some circles, that they will say, "Oh, you are an Indian chauvinist," but we say, "Well, you all appear to be European chauvinists." So, at any rate. That's where they get all these weird dates for the Vedas, and that's where we see that Western scholarship has all these strange understandings of the Vedas, of Bhagavad Gita, why they don't accept the Bhagavad Gita the way the Bhagavad Gita accepts itself, and so on and so forth. So we've talked already a little bit about glottochronology, this idea that the languages change in the same way that radioactive decay occurs. That's the way that they've described it in the, in literature, that languages change like radioactive decay. So there's a half-life that, it gradually, a language will change. Half of it changes within a certain amount of time, and then half of that changes in a certain amount of time. Some way you can figure out who spoke what, when, and where, and how things are likely to have happened. So, at any rate, that's glottochronology. But this has fallen out of favor. It doesn't get talked about so much as being able to explain when and where something happened. It's not such a good anthropological tool. So, at any rate, this is why Western scholarship has all these misconceptions about the Vedas, particularly Bhagavad Gita. So when you study Bhagavad Gita and you talk to people, or maybe you run across something about Bhagavad Gita, you will, if it's not coming from, the devotional literature, it will have these misconceptions nicely riveted in different places. These that couldn't, this must be mythical. What about our invading Aryans from the north somewhere? What about this previous language, Proto-Indo-European, and this and that and the other? So this is why we find all these other, aspects of Western packaging of the Vedas very sort of gives everyone a misunderstanding, a wrong picture. Okay, so any questions about that? And then we'll... So next week we will be talking about the Mahabharata. So we've talked about a little bit, last week we talked about philosophy. This week we've tried to put Gita in a historical and a, academic perspective. And next week we'll be talking about how the Bhagavad Gita comes out of the Mahabharata. Yeah.
So during all this,
Actually, it won't be next week. It'll be 2 weeks from now, I think. Yeah. Next week I'm at the Bhakti Center. That's what it is.
during the timeline of everything that was going on in India, there was always a chain of people keeping the core concepts of the Vedas alive, just kind of maintaining its purity throughout all the madness. Do the other religions have any similar concept from what you've seen?
As far as I know, no. There's some things that are unique to the whole Vedic system, the idea of a parampara. Things changed in other religious traditions, whereas as far as the Vaishnava tradition, the basics have always been the basics. They were there from the very beginning. Nothing really substantial has been added. Certainly, cultures change, times change. People have different applications and so on and so forth, but nothing like that, Again, we see that sometimes the Vedic literature was quite prominent, even on the whole planet, and other times now, Vedic literature was almost completely obscured, where very few people really understood what it was really about. It's always been there in some form or another, just like other religious texts and other religious writings. But oftentimes it was heavily misunderstood. So that's there.